we are ready to get started. I'm just going to introduce myself really quick and then hand it over to Dr. Kevin Marino. But I'm Ryan Fogarty. I'm just hosting, facilitating this training today. We're really excited to bring this topic up because it's one that everyone is dealing with on a pretty regular basis in the world of social work, law enforcement, behavioral health, lots of different groups that sort of overlap in different areas in serving our communities. And we're going to talk about abuse and misuse at some point and kind of explain some of that. But really, we see this as a dynamic, constantly changing kind of thing. And so we've got some experts on here today to help us know what's the latest and what's going on with some of these substances and the behaviors associated with them. But here at the Real Academy, we take pride in training social workers. We have a team of expert child welfare workers who have been developing simulation and lots of other modes of training to help improve skill sets for those who work with families, with children, and to best help them and really operate in more of a preventative sense as well. So that's just a little bit about the Real Academy. We've only been around for a couple of years, but Dr. Marino founded this, and he's been working in simulation work for child welfare workers much longer. So Kevin, I'm going to hand it over to you. I'll run the slides. And, we have a pretty big group on here, so we're not going to be able to know where everyone's coming from. But if anyone does have questions, we'll try to field some questions at the end. So if you have them, drop them in the chat for us, and we'll do our best to address those. And also, if you have some just questions that are burning, we'll go over the hour for anyone who's willing to stay and just kind of answer or ask questions. So that's not a problem. But we don't expect everyone to stay. This is only a lunch and learn. So go ahead and grab a bite and let's get started, okay?
Thanks, Ryan. Ryan is very modest and humble. He's our Director of Operations here at the Real Academy. I am Dr. Kevin Marino. I have more than 25 years experience in the field. I come from a clinical background. I have a retired license at this point as a psychological associate, licensed clinical addiction specialist. I have a forensics background and worked in forensics for several years in behavioral profiling. And in the behavioral units here locally in North Carolina, I help do consultation and things of that nature. Went into child welfare on accident, believe it or not. It was an accident I got into child welfare work. It was just the perfect alignment of North Carolina's behavioral health system was really disrupted. And I was a much younger person at the time and had a brand new baby, and I needed insurance. So I had some friends draft me over to Child Protection Services, and I have had a wonderful career there. I went to the training in North Carolina here to certify social workers, and I was appalled. Just to be frank, I was appalled at the standards. All we have to do is look like we're interested in what's going on in the training room, be a little interactive, and that's how we're certified. The clinical world is completely opposite of that, to where I had to have 1,500 hours of supervised visits, 1,500 hours, that was pre-graduate, postgraduate, another 1,500 hours. Then I probably paid out thousands of dollars to take tests to make sure that I understood what I was doing. And so I've dedicated my life to helping agencies and social workers and in a multidisciplinary field to where all these things interact with child welfare and child protection services to come up with what we are delivering today and our simulation trainings and the other things that we do here at Real Academy. And so I'm very excited. This is a topic very, very close to my heart. I've asked some super close friends of mine that have been working in the field and that are much smarter than me. Dr. Michelle Geiser, would you introduce yourself?
Yeah, Absolutely. So good morning. I guess it's almost afternoon now, but so I am a program director for a local nonprofit, and the nonprofit that I'm with focuses on the continuum of care for substance use disorders. So it's cradle to grave. So we're looking at everything from prevention, education, advocacy, and recovery. And so we do on a day-to-day basis kind of interact with individuals anywhere within that spectrum. My background started as a school counselor, moved into a focus with trauma psychology, and I've been working within substance use disorders for about 7 years now. I'm really trying to get at the root cause and getting upstream and just understanding addiction at its roots, and then how we can come in with preventative, interventive, and recovery measures to support the individuals that we work with. That's me.
Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Michelle. And we have with us recently retired Detective Freddie Westfall, who has lots of experience. Freddie?
Hey, am I unmuted, by the way?
Yeah, we can hear you, Freddie.
Okay, good. Sorry, I've got my dog with me, and he's protecting me from Amazon and anybody else that might happens by the house. I'm Freddie Westfall. I've worked both on the state and local level and federal law enforcement. Most of my career has been in narcotics investigations, from street level drugs to trafficking organizations. Got about 16, 17 years basically just working narcotics crimes. In my experience from doing hundreds or maybe thousands of interviews with addicts, traffickers, children, and the community that surrounds these people, has given me a lot of insight of what's been going on with the current trends.
Great. Glad to have you, Freddie.
Thanks, Freddie. And last but absolutely not least is the fantastic and fabulous Miss Dee Hunt.
Hi, everyone. It's great.
Oh, she's representing North Carolina.
Well, hey, this is our great state. Hi, everyone. My name is Dee Hunt. I love child welfare because, and you can tell because it's all I've ever done. I started down this road in 1981 under the umbrella of social work, and have just stayed in it because I absolutely love it. Retired, and I've done everything from intake to adoption. Was a state trainer for 17 years, worked in a county DSS for 17 years, and for 2 years was a child welfare program monitor, where I traveled 100 counties reviewing the child welfare cases. Have been a program manager, one in Person County, and right now in Rutherford County for a little while longer, where I supervise the adult services and child welfare units. So I'm just excited. I've been with the Real Academy before Real Academy became Real Academy. Met Kevin in the training room, and we have been, literally professional partners for a very long time. From the classroom until now. So I've been with the Real Academy for a couple of years, and we have just been on this road to do everything in our power to address child maltreatment in the best way that we can, and make sure that we have helped families and helping children become productive citizens in our society. So that's what we're still doing. Thank you for this opportunity, Real Academy.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thank you, Dee. All right, let's jump right in.
Yeah, let's do this.
Okay, substance abuse, as we look at it as a typology of child maltreatment, from state to state, each state has a categorization for child maltreatment. All 50 contiguous states and those as a part of our continuum all recognize substance misuse or substance abuse as a form of child maltreatment. And so we're all collected here because we either work directly as a child welfare professional, or we're part of a my lunch is here, a multidisciplinary team to where we touch child maltreatment. That's why we have Dr. Geiser here from the clinical world. That's why we have Detective Westfall here from the law enforcement world, because a lot of times the folks that we are serving, the families we are serving, they are also serving at the same time. So learning from their perspectives and tethering in a multidisciplinary fashion will help us to protect children in our communities at a much more accurate rate and pace. So what are we going to get into today?
Sorry, Kevin. I was having a problem with my clicker.
No worries. Okay, so substance abuse, substance misuse is a fluid topic. It changes faster than we can keep up with. And the challenges that we faced in the 70s changed from the 80s. The challenges that we faced in the 80s changed from the 90s. And then in today, is changing at a much faster rate than we've ever experienced in any other point in time in history. The challenges that we're facing today are more man-made chemicals, and now we're dealing with fentanyl at a rapid pace. And so it's a fluid topic, and it requires those of us that are training and teaching to adapt to that fluidity. And so as we change and learn more, then we bring more trainings to the forefront so that you that are working in the fields or supervising or administrating child protection, law enforcement, or clinicals, you're up to speed and up to date with what we're seeing in the field. Oh, make sure you're on mute. I hear a little bit of echo in the background. Thank you. So keeping up to date is challenging because it's always changing. Details about human behavior and how it impacts decision making. Okay, so human behavior is what we're really targeted on when we look at child maltreatment, because it's the behavior of the parent, the caretaker, the guardian, the custodian that is impacting the child, placing them in danger or has manifested itself in harm and safety and risk. So we're going to introduce an overview of various drugs and prescription, non-prescription behaviors through this lunch and learn and hear from our expert panels. We're going to work through some harm and danger experiences as Dee and I unpack how maltreatment is defined and how we can identify and treat these behaviors to keep children more safe. So our learning objectives today for this lunch and learn is that we're going to talk to Dr. Geiser and understand the clinical definitions, and because those have changed as well. And from my understanding, they continue to have some nuances. There's different interpretations. So hearing from our clinical professionals would really help us in law enforcement and in child protection services to really understand what we're seeing. In my 5-year-old brain, I need things to be very, very simple. I always tell my folks, keep it simple, social workers, okay? Because it's already complex enough. So we're gonna look at the common definitions. We're gonna define that also in child maltreatment, substance abuse, substance misuse, and child maltreatment. We're gonna take a brief look into the brain science behind addiction. I'm gonna give you a very practical tool that you can actually use in the field with your families. Recognize known behaviors linked to using these substances. Substances definitely impact how we feel, how we behave, how we think. And so we're going to walk through some of those things. And then we're going to learn these unique perspectives from each of our professionals so that we can walk away with a more holistic understanding and help us better partner in our communities. Okay, Dr. Geiser, can you help us understand some of the definitions around substance use disorder?
Absolutely. And so what you're saying is correct. So the landscape of substance use has shifted. The language that we're using is constantly morphing. And so you'll hear a lot of individuals in the field now talking about substance use and misuse together. And so when we're talking about a substance use disorder, that looks like substance use or misuse. So if you're an adult and you're allowed legally to engage in alcohol consumption, you might maybe using a substance. Now, when you transition from substance use to misuse is when we're using it in a way that is designed then to harm our body. So we know that binge drinking looks like drinking more than 4 drinks in one, or more than 14 drinks in a week-long period. And then so once you transition from that traditional use to misuse, you're starting to become classified as having a substance use disorder. So substance use is now being classified as a mental health disorder. It's a disease of the brain, and it impacts behavior. And so that's basically how we're looking at substance use. There are a lot of indicators for individuals who have transitioned into having a substance use disorder. And then we have kind of substance use disorders first cousin, which is addiction. So drug addiction is really the most severe type of substance use disorder. So it falls under the umbrella of a substance use disorder, but it stands within its own typography, and that is that it becomes a chronic condition, right? And so we're looking at the individual as having this chronic condition if we're thinking more along the lines of high blood pressure, diabetes. And so we're looking at that individual's experience with substances has transitioned to a point where they've become physically dependent upon the substance that they've been using. And so that's really the delineation between having a substance use disorder and then transitioning into full-blown addiction as we see it.
Dr. Geiser, can you help us explain what you mean by chronic?
So when we see individuals who have moved into that addiction phase, oftentimes that translates into individuals not being able to meet obligations any longer. They're engaged in risky behaviors that are negatively impacting their lives. And so perhaps that is having multiple DUIs or DWIs, no longer presenting themselves at work, no longer engaging socially. It could look like neglecting their children. It could look like maybe engaging in more violent behaviors. And so knowing that they're engaging in these different areas of risk-taking behavior, but being unable to pull themselves back from it. So because of the chronic nature of their disease, without having stop measures in place, without connecting those individuals to treatment, the likelihood that they're going to be able to transition away from this chronic disease is very small. And so we need to be able to access recovery, one, be able to identify who's moving into the addiction phase, and then two, how we can come alongside those individuals and help to move them away from chronic use. And oftentimes that will look like something like engaging in medication-assisted recovery, or maybe an intensive outpatient service. And so, there are many pathways to recovery, but knowing that typically this is not a matter of someone's staying power or strength as an individual once it's transitioned to a chronic disease, but it really has to have different supports from the outside.
Is there any association of time in that timeline where you can put a flag in the ground and say, okay, now it's chronic because it's been over this amount of time?
I would say that, we would like to say that there was a real linear explanation of the transition from substance use disorders to addiction, but the real answer to that question is no, because it depends largely on what we're using and how we're using it. And so a lot of addiction, it's really dependent on dose. And so there's this correlation between the frequency and dose of the substance that you're using. So for instance, if we have somebody who's engaged in using fentanyl and is dosing daily for maybe a week, they can already transition into addiction because of the nature of fentanyl. The addiction rate for fentanyl and other opioids is much higher than it is for, say, THC. So if we have an individual who is dosing themselves with even synthetic THC for a week, they are not necessarily going to go into addiction, but that's been the same time frame. So it's really a dosing question as well as a potency of the substance that they're using.
Okay, so when we're talking about this, time isn't necessarily what we should associate. We should really be looking at the different domains of life that the substance is impacting. Is that right?
Yeah. So, we see individuals frequently who do very well managing their obligations in life during the substance use disorder phase. And as we start to transition into the addiction phase is where we really see some of those day-to-day functionalities starting to fail. And so if we're looking at youth, that might be truancy. So maybe people aren't, attending school any longer, they're skipping classes. That translates really easily into the adult world. Or, your employees coming in tardy, are they no longer responsive when supervisors are trying to make calls or recommendations? And then in the case of social services, if you are trying to engage a parent and they are no longer responsive, you're not receiving text, you're not receiving phone calls, there's no correspondence, or there's extreme avoidance, and normally that should send a red flag that something has shifted in that relationship to cause some of those obligations to be paused.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Geiser. And then we have the three common classes of the medications that we see quite a bit. We see opioids, oxycodone, hydrocodone, fentanyl, morphine, and heroin. We're seeing those at more and more frequently these days, especially fentanyl, more heroin usage these days. The depressants that are often prescribed, diazepam, clonazepam, and then alcohol use. Stimulants, here we see a lot of just Adderall or ADHD medications, and then methamphetamine and cocaine. It just real quickly, what are you seeing more in the clinical world today?
I think that the thing that we're noticing the most and most frequently is actually polysubstance use. And so understanding when we're looking at a lot of these overdose numbers that individuals who are presenting at emergency departments are not testing positive only for an opioid. Actually, typically it's an opioid and a depressant in some form or another, whether it's a benzodiazepine and alcohol, but almost never do we see overdoses that are one substance. And so polysubstance use is something that when you're in the world of addiction, you see more and more frequently and communicating with people. If their drug of choice is fentanyl, but it's not readily available, something's happened to their access, they will switch and they will switch easily into another substance. And so perhaps for the following week, they'll be using methamphetamines for that week. And so just understanding that substance use addiction is really fluid, and that, there really isn't the single substance that individuals are using. And that being said, also, we have noticed that, especially in neighboring counties, they've been using fentanyl test strips to see what we're able to see in the various substances that are being sold on the street. And the feedback I'd received from our neighboring county, which is much larger than we are, very urban, was that their fentanyl test strips were positive for any substance that they tested. So whether they were testing marijuana that was being sold, or methamphetamine that was being sold, or they were testing pills that were on the market, each substance that they tested was positive for fentanyl. And so that's really concerning, just because of the potency of fentanyl and then the ease at which it can be added and mingled with any of the substances listed here.
Thank you, Dr. Geiser. So let's talk about the brain science and the reward system just a little bit. Just to talk about what Dr. Geiser's saying is that what's happening in the brain that creates chemical dependence, because at some point we have choice, but then our brain starts to memorize its use. So here, a lot of you may have seen this before. In regards to, how does our brain work, the reward system, the dopamine uptake system that makes us feel pleasure and joy, right? Okay, so I need everybody to be really mature during this conversation. Let's just get that straight. So when I'm feeling happy, there's a great day outside, it's sunny outside, I feel that amount of joy. And let's say that gives you 100 points of dopamine that day, just feel great. Eating, we're all having lunch. Dopamine is really great. And that's like 200 points. Oh, and then we just fall in love, whether it's with someone or a puppy or a kitty or whatever animal that you love that day. Maybe that's 300 points. And also sex. When I have really, really good sex, that's like, 700 points. And so what happens is your dopamine levels, you have a natural baseline of recovery in the brain. And when these natural things that we do every day and the brain memorizes, dopamine that gives us the happy feelings, the euphoric feelings, is able to readjust itself. I love watching the faces when I talk about brain science. These are my 5-year-old drawings to help me understand. Now we're going to introduce substances. Let's talk about methamphetamine. For someone that uses methamphetamine, now remember, really good sex is 700 points. I take a hit of methamphetamine, and then all of a sudden I am off the chart, and that gives me well over 2,000 points. And the more I use, it drops below the baseline of where my natural dopamine creates happy, euphoric feelings. And so recovery time has to go into overload, and your body takes longer. And in the reward system of a brain, this is where the behavioral memory is taking place. And so the more you replace your natural dopamine with these types of chemicals, your brain remembers that. And that's where your urges come from. And that's where it holds hostage your brain. And how you function. That's how we see it working with the limbic system and impacting motor function, thinking, cognition. All of these areas are compacted. And so that's a little bit behind the brain science. And this is something that I use in the field all the time with families. If I'm dealing with parents, caretakers, or guardians that are using substances, sometimes that initial phase that helps motivate change is doing a simple example like this to help them understand what's going on with my body right now. So inside of that, what I want to target is the overview of behaviors. Dr. Geiser gave us some of those examples, but let me tell you why before that, while I'm talking about brain science, is around some of the research specifically in child welfare. Why is this so important? When I did an academic journal search of how much we're actually studying in child protection services, the amount of cases that substance abuse touches, more than 90% of all child protection, child welfare cases are either from an allegation of substance misuse that's impacted the care of the child, or it's a secondary or tertiary allegation. So 90% plus of all child welfare cases in the nation are touching substance misuse in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so inside of that, the research in this topic in child protection is relatively new. When you look at doing the inclusion process of key terms, substance misuse, child welfare cases, and you look at foster care cases, of all of the academic journals out there, there are just a little over 4,000 academic journals that have been published on this subject. So when you look at the specification of a subject, this is a really shallow pool of research. The majority of that research is from 2015 on. More than 82% of the academic journals that are published on substance misuse and child welfare connectivity are 82%. So you can see the correlation around the opioid epidemics and the impacts in child welfare, more exposure, and then academics have begun to research those elements. So this is a topic that needs continued attention. So inside of that research and what's going on in the brain science, let's talk more specifically about what behaviors are impacted by these substances. Let's hear from Detective Westfall for a minute. Freddie, what types of behaviors have you seen when you go out and see families or folks that are using substances? Don't forget to unmute yourself.
You got me? All right.
Gotcha.
We can hear you.
Thank you very much. My experience is very different from everybody else's here, because generally if I'm knocking at your door, it is not a good day for you, not whatsoever. I wasn't in that type of law enforcement where I'm actually there to help people per se. I'm there investigating drug crimes. So the first how would I say, the reaction that I get is twofold, especially when there's children there, is from the parents is the fear of arrest or the fear of their children being taken from them. So getting past that, the things that I generally saw is, and it really ranged on the type of narcotic that we're dealing with. With methamphetamine specifically, and I've done it for such a long time in our community here, I got to see the difference between bathtub methamphetamine, which had a much lower quantitative value than what we were getting out of Central and South America. And the level of addiction went very, very high. When you're talking about the sex drive that accompanies methamphetamine use, I was having to go over video after video after video from people's phones and logs and stuff like that, specifically looking for children being injured and or children being present when these things were taking place. And at the beginning, more often than not, we would find that, activity from sex orgies in the backyard. And then in the background, you can see the kids on the swing sets, that are taking place of that. With drugs such as the opioids, of parents nodding out and leaving the children completely unattended. I've knocked on doors. And I'll never forget, it was a 3-year-old. And when we said that we were with the police, she said, "Thank you very much. I can't get mom up." And so we went in there, we were able to revive mom. The child, we have no idea how long the child had been running around the house loose, but the child did get into mom's cash. And so there was about $7,000 of $100 bills laying out throughout the whole place. So the child had been there for quite a long time trying to keep herself active. With children's behavior, it would range from being very, very sullen and fear to overly excitement, with our presence that was in there. The levels of neglect were, from environmental, if they are smoking from pipes, whether it's, cocaine, methamphetamine, marijuana, all that is definitely being exposed to the children. We've had several cases where bringing in social workers, they've had children being tested, and they're finding, from hair samples and stuff like that, the drugs are actually in their system. So anything more that I could that you want me to go over?
Thank you, Freddie. No, I think as far, would you have any advice to those of us that are out in the field every day of what are some behaviors that we should look for? Or maybe are there any questions that would be helpful for us to ask when we're working with individuals that may be misusing substances?
Well, I mean, you're the typical look for bruises, any marks, any signs of mistreatment. One of the best things that I've found on seeing if the other people in the house are being taken care of is definitely look in the refrigerator and the cabinets and see what type of foods are there, or isn't there, for the child. Those are questions that I do ask, because the children, in my experience, become very, very protective. And so when you are speaking with the children and it seems like they're taking a role of protection, that should be a big red flag for you. You can ask questions like, well, when was the last time you ate? What did you eat? Or what did you have for breakfast? Or, those type of questions kind of give you an idea of what's going on. Another question is, are you here alone, and how often does it happen, and how long that is. You can, it's very, and I'm definitely not on your side of or was never on your side of helping people. I always kept my questions away from putting the child as an informant to me on the parent's behavior, just because that's putting them in a very dangerous position. So what I did, which was helpful, is sometimes canvassing the neighborhood and talking to neighbors and just asking questions to the neighbors. Hey, do you ever see the kids out here late at night? And you'll be amazed at the questions. They're like, yeah, I've seen them out there at 11 o'clock playing soccer at night, and it's, it's 28 degrees, and, they're out there for quite a long periods of time. So you can actually find very good information from outside the environment of the house, in itself.
Thank you, Freddie. Dr. Geiser, and those are some really good nuggets that you gave us. Dr. Geiser, what behaviors keep you up at night that you see from your perspective?
So everything keeps me up at night when it comes to this topic. But I will say, just for, Freddie having his experience, and although he's coming at it from law enforcement, I think you can hear from the way he speaks about it that our law enforcement is very engaged in the overall experience of the children engaged in the families. And even though they're coming from that perspective, I think a lot of what we're seeing is the same. And so although we're not there to investigate the use of drugs in a household, we are trying to determine, like, are you physically healthy? Are you being neglected? Are you neglecting yourself? And so I do think we look at a lot of those same elements, and they come across families, no matter which agency is interacting with them. But the thing that always strikes me, and that I've had definitely some sleepless nights over, is that there are a lot of substances that we identify as like, oh, if this person is engaged in using methamphetamine, what are we going to look for? We're going to start looking at the condition of their skin, their hair, their energy levels. And so there's some outward indicators that substances are becoming a problem that are really indicative of certain substances. The thing I've noticed is opioids are not in the same kind of frame as a lot of other substances. And so there seems to be a longer period where individuals can misuse opioids without it indicating to the general public that there's a problem. So if you start off, think of with prescription opioids due to maybe a surgery or dental work, and you're misusing them, there's not a whole lot of indicators that we're seeing. People can function relatively well for a long period of time. Does that mean they are actually functioning well in their home? No. Does it mean that their children are being taken care of? Also not. And so, but outwardly, they can still typically drive a vehicle, go to work until that substance use has reached that tipping point that we talked about earlier, where you're moving into addiction, and maybe you're transitioning into more of your fentanyl and heroin and other substances that are going to give you that bigger rush of dopamine that you were talking about in the brain science. And so I think just being aware that a lot of times by the time we are brought into the fold, whether it's law enforcement, social services, or prevention specialists like us, it's often when someone is really far down that road. And so knowing that a lot of these problems, by the time we're seeing them, that addiction problem has been persistent for a good amount of time leading up to the issues that we're seeing that are forward facing.
Thank you, Dr. Geiser. So let's talk about, we've heard some law enforcement and clinical impressions, and we get some generalizations of how this impacts families and children specifically. And so let's talk about the maltreatments focused in. So let's take all these strands and put them together for child maltreatment. Dee, what are some of the things we look for as we categorize and typologize substance misuse as a child maltreatment?
Good morning again, everyone. Child maltreatment and substance use certainly has a huge link, and there are things that we look for. So those typical behaviors that we look for are the things that we're going to hear from the schools. The people making the reports is that the child is not sleeping in school. I mean, the child is sleeping in school because they may not be sleeping at home. That the child is not coming to school. So you may notice that there's absenteeism, truancy. You may notice that the child is jittery. You may even notice that the child has a flat affect, that, you know, things are going on around them and the child is not even connected. There are things, so a lot of times we see things in child welfare from the children first because we are child welfare. So once we see those behaviors in the children, and there are many, many more, then of course we look at what those typical behaviors are with those parents. And some of those behaviors are those supervision issues. They're leaving the children home alone. One of the things that was mentioned earlier are, you know, when it gets to misuse, now they're not able to come home when they're supposed to. They may have said, you know, just be here for just a little bit, I'll be right back. But then that substance use gets them to the point to where they're either using more, now they're passed out and they don't go back home to their children. So we're seeing all these little typical things that let you know that there's some issues going on with substance use. And all of those things are certainly about child maltreatment. Kevin?
Thanks, Dee. And the spectrum spans, right? It can begin with substance-affected infants. We know we had recent legislation that changed for the majority of the states because it was captured under the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, and how it was redesigned. And so when a child is born and they test positive for a substance, then the majority of the jurisdictions would respond with a child safety assessment or an investigation. And that stems over into, it could also include abuse. Abuse could be under the umbrella of substance misuse, and because the parent's behavior, because they're under the influence of a substance, could lead to the child being sexually abused. So now you have various typologies of maltreatment happening to the child, or that they could be, I know that one of our staff was just telling me that a parent was angry. They were out of control on use of substances and jerked a 2-year-old up by the leg. That is incredibly dangerous for a 2-year-old. So you could have serious injury. You could have the child becoming dependent on substances themselves, substance-affected infants, children that have paraphernalia or drugs in their reach. One of the things that Detective Westfall was explaining to me a couple weeks ago that just really rattled my cage. With fentanyl, it has like this clear backing that you peel off of the patch that you put on. And he told me he goes into homes with a flashlight and flashes this light on the floor to see if any reflective elements are on the floor. Because if a 3-year-old child steps on that, they're automatically exposed to fentanyl. And that could be a fatal exposure. So there is a lot of things to consider when we talk about engaging, identifying maltreatment with substance misuse. For me as a practitioner, I feel like my head's got to be on a swivel constantly, engaging, interacting. There are a couple things that we have produced for you here at the Real Academy. That are it's downloadable content. It's free for you for joining us at the Lunch and Learn today. The first is a dedicated document that we wrote just on marijuana usage, especially with more and more states coming in and making legislative to make it legal. It's still impactful in the home. And then recognizing unhealthy drug use. That document goes through all drug types, and I give you a list of behaviors to look for under each drug type, and I give you some questions, specific questions to help you determine or validate if you're seeing any concerns around maltreatment there. Oftentimes we get in the field and it's tough to create and craft questions that help us get to the heart of determining maltreatment. This document will help you. They're yours for free for joining us today. And I'm sorry, but our time is almost up here at this Lunch and Learn. I want to encourage everybody. Next week, we've got a case workshop. We're going to dive deep into the practitioner's role. How do the clinician, the law enforcement, and the child protective professional come together and work these cases out? We're going to dig into some cases. We're going to look at the decisions that we make as child protective professionals. And we're going to look at how do we help serve and protect children in our communities through that case workshop. So sign up for that. It's very economical and affordable, and we'll have time for more discussion and discuss how this multidisciplinary team works together.
Yeah,
Ryan?
Kevin, can I jump in real quick on that? Kevin and I really value interaction and engagement for our courses. So while our lunch and learns aren't really designed that way, unless we just happen to have one where there's less people and we feel the freedom to engage, we really typically can't do that. But in our case workshops, we have a good time working together. And the hope is that we'll work through 2 real life, I put that in quotes because we're obviously not going to give out people's real information, but we are going to provide 2 cases that are real to life. So we'll work through those together as a class, as a 20-person cohort. So there's still some space in there if you're interested. And I think most of you found us on Eventbrite. You can find the case workshop there as well. It's pretty easy. Going back to something that Kevin was mentioning before, the 2 downloads. When I close out the presentation, I'll drop in the links into our chat where you can go to our website and download those 2 documents. So I'll do that in just a minute. But before we do that, I wanted to give Kevin an opportunity to kind of share about this book that just got released. Kevin, you want to share about that real quick?
So just briefly, Dr. Robert Wright and I have been doing research since 2014 in regards to how collaboration works specifically in child welfare circles. And so this is a wonderful tool for practitioners and leaders in child welfare to explore practical ways that you can collaborate at your local and with your state folks. We walk through basic elements formulated from Herbert Simon. For those of you that don't know Herbert Simon and administrative theory and administrative behavior, please go look him up, read his work. It's fascinating, it's brilliant. But this book encapsulates our journey here in North Carolina, how we conceptualize simulation, the process, how we tethered together to work together to build the practice that we have here at Real Academy. It's all practitioner driven. We don't do any trainings that our practitioners do not want. That's why we build training for the people by the people. And we also work through the elements of deep trust and how important deep trust is in your organization as well as in your practice. And then we move into elements of decision-making in child welfare. There's little research done there. It is an area of expertise of mine. I've done many years of research in decision-making alone. This book is one article or one culmination of publication. I have another article coming out very soon. And Bob and I also have another article that we did back in 2015 for the state of North Carolina that is on our website that you can download for free through our insights page on our website. So this is available to you at Barnes & Noble's, Amazon. We'd love for you to get that book, tell us what you think, and then call us up and have a conversation.
Ryan, it's Dee. I want to go ahead and just mention one thing because I think this is something that we're all in together when we think about substance use disorders and child abuse and neglect. They're connected. Certainly, and I don't think that anyone on the phone has not had a case that was dealing with child abuse. Know that those children that you're seeing and that those children that you're visiting, it's highly likely that they may become substance misusers themselves, simply because they have been abused or neglected as a child. So we are in this together to break this cycle. And so I just really, really strongly encourage you to also join the class next week, because it's a deeper training on this and how we can break that cycle.
Yeah,
Thanks, Dee. I got a question from one of our learners here present with me, and not really a question, but really just to point out, maybe Dr. Geiser can speak to this. And so when we go to have drug screens completed to help us understand what's happening with an individual, and specifically a child, that we have to request for a fentanyl test to be done, because the traditional tests do not detect fentanyl. Dr. Geiser, can you speak to that just briefly?
So right now, as far as I've seen with our Child Advocacy Center and their drug testing and their screening, it seems like, yeah, whether or not fentanyl is new on the market in one way or another. And so I think everything governmentally takes a lot of time to catch up to the trends that we're seeing. But I would say that it is less likely to find opioids in a child's system and more likely to find methamphetamines, just because of the nature of cooking methamphetamines. And so a lot of the exposure happens in certain ways. But I would say fentanyl has become so popular that we really need to get in front of law enforcement and legislation and let them know that there is a necessity to have everyone tested for fentanyl and fentanyl exposure, because of what we said earlier with the fent strips that we're seeing, testing everything positive. I would say that there's absolute necessity to have every child tested for fentanyl, regardless of what the parent's substance of choice is.
Thank you, Dr. Geiser. I know that when I was working with another law enforcement agency, I didn't know this. I learned something every single day when I'm practicing. So microwaves, cooking methamphetamine in a microwave, and children heating up their food in a microwave. Most children learn how to heat food up in a microwave or cook mac and cheese in a microwave. Well, we had a drug-exposed child, drug-endangered child, because the parents were cooking methamphetamine in the microwave, and then the 7-year-old kid was making his mac and cheese in the microwave with it. And so what I learned was, when you look in a microwave, I know that's like super intruding, right? Looking at somebody, hey, can I look in your microwave? What? You look in somebody's microwave, and so there's like this purplish green film. Freddie, have you ever seen that in a microwave?
No, I've never seen that in a microwave. With microwave use that I've seen is crack cocaine, especially if they're doing a whipping process. And so with crack cocaine, what you also find is Pyrex dishes that'll be around with a white film, thick white residue that will be completely around the rim of it.
Wow. So don't just think that they're dishwashers on the fritz. If you see Pyrex on the counter with a thick white film on it, don't touch it.
yeah.
Be safe. Don't touch it.
Well, and the interesting thing is, like, so Freddie, when you come into a situation like that, like, you've got at that point, that total freedom to come in and really look at things and investigate things. I think that the difficulty for child welfare workers is that, you're there to observe and take notes of these different things. And so you have to be, like, really pretty clever without invading someone's privacy, right? Because you're supposed to look for food and make sure that the electric works, water works, the smoke detector, all that kind of stuff, right? But, it's something to think about, how you can go about taking notice of that, probably within that rapport building process, right, Kevin?
Yeah, definitely there, rapport building, for certain. Oh, you're welcome, Washington State. Thanks for joining us. Yeah, rapport building is really important. Again, the trust factor, building the trust factor on limited amount of time is critical, and it takes a high curation of skill, something that we have to constantly work on.
If I can add to that, just use your natural senses. Use your sense of smell. Use what you're of course you're going to be hearing what's going on, but your use of sight, and be curious. If something looks odd or out of place, a lot of times, it is odd and out of place, and you just don't dismiss it. The funny thing about human beings, we're the only animal on the planet that dismisses fear. And so we have to pay attention to that rather than just dismiss it. And there's nothing wrong with just asking a question of what's this and what's that. The things that I've located throughout the house, in children's rooms, is just horrible, So if you're paying attention, it's questionable, like just like a Pyrex dish. Not many people would understand what that is or what it looks like, and so you just ask, what is this? What is that? Those type of things. And with building rapport, you'll see a change in body language and how people they'll start hedging or trying to change the subject on you, when you are getting something a little bit too close, that at least in their mind, they might find it detrimental for their type of lifestyle or their addiction.
That's a great point, Freddie, and thanks for bringing that out, because at the end of the day, I'm going to protect me, right? Yeah. It's just natural. It's just natural human behavior. We shouldn't be offended by that. We just let that roll. We call it rolling with resistance, and just keep moving forward. All right. Well, that wraps up our time for today. We're so glad everybody got to hang out for lunch today.